From the caves and jungles of Hindustan, the classic narrative by Madame Blavatsky, vanished glories, Benares, Prayaga, now Allahabad, Nasik, Hurdwar, Badrinath, Mathura. These were the sacred places of prehistoric India, which we were to visit one after the other, but to visit them, not after the usual manner of tourists, a volume d'oiseau with a cheap guidebook in our hands and a cicerone to weary our brains and wear out our legs. We were well aware that all these ancient places are thronged with traditions and overgrown with the weeds of popular fancy, like ruins of ancient castles covered with ivy. That the original shape of the building is destroyed by the cold embrace of these parasitic plants, and that it is as difficult for the archaeologist to form an idea of the architecture of the once perfect edifice, judging only by the heaps of disfigured rubbish that cover the country, as for us to select from out the thick mass of legends good wheat from weeds. No guides and no cicerone could be of any use whatever to us. The only thing they could do would be to point out to us places where once there stood a fortress, a castle, a temple, a sacred grove, or a celebrated town, and then to repeat legends which came into existence only lately, under the Mussulman rule. As to the undisguised truth, the original history of every interesting spot, we should have had to search for these by ourselves, assisted only by our own conjectures. Modern India does not present a pale shadow of what it was in the pre-Christian era, nor even of the Hindustan of the days of Akbar, Shah Jahan and Aurangzeb. The neighbourhood of every town that has been shattered by many a war, and of every ruined hamlet, is covered with round reddish pebbles, as if with so many petrified tears of blood. But in order to approach the iron gate of some ancient fortress, it is not over natural pebbles that it is necessary to walk, but over the broken fragments of some older granite remains, under which, very often, rest the ruins of a third town, still more ancient than the last. Modern names have been given to them by Mussulmans, who generally built their towns upon the remains of those they had just taken by assault. The names of the latter are sometimes mentioned in the legends, but the names of their predecessors had completely disappeared from the popular memory, even before the Mussulman invasion. Will a time ever come for these secrets of the centuries to be revealed? Knowing all this beforehand, we resolved not to lose patience, even though we had to devote whole years to explorations of the same places in order to obtain better historical information and facts less disfigured than those obtained by our predecessors, who had to be contented with a choice collection of naive lies, poured forth from the mouth of some frightened semi-savage, or some Brahmin, unwilling to speak and desirous of disguising the truth. As for ourselves, we were differently situated. We were helped by a whole society of educated Hindus, who were as deeply interested in the same questions as ourselves. Besides, we had a promise of the revelation of some secrets, and the accurate translation of some ancient chronicles that had been preserved as if by a miracle. The history of India has long since faded from the memories of her sons, and is still a mystery to her conquerors. Doubtless it still exists, though, perchance only partly, in manuscripts that are jealously concealed from every European eye. This has been shown by some pregnant words, spoken by Brahmins on their rare occasions of friendly expansiveness. Thus, Colonel Todd, whom I have already quoted several times, is said to have been told by a Mahant, the chief of an ancient pagoda monastery, "Sahib, you lose your time in vain researches. The Balati India, India of foreigners, is before you, but you will never see the Gupta India, secret India. We are the guardians of her mysteries, and would rather cut out each other's tongues than speak." Yet nevertheless, Todd succeeded in learning a good deal. It must be borne in mind that no Englishman has ever been loved so well by the natives as this old and courageous friend of the Maharana of Udaipur, who, in his turn, was so friendly towards the natives that the humblest of them never saw a trace of contempt in his demeanour. He wrote before ethnology had reached its present stage of development, but his book is still an authority on everything concerning Rajasthan. Though the author's opinion of his work was not very high, though he stated that, It is nothing but a conscientious collection of materials for a future historian. Still in this book is to be found many a thing undreamed of by any British civil servant. Let our friends smile incredulously. Let our enemies laugh at our pretensions to penetrate the world mysteries of Aryavata, as a certain critic recently expressed himself. However pessimistic may be our critics' views, yet even in the event of our conclusions not proving more trustworthy than those of Ferguson, Wilson, Wheeler and the rest of the archaeologists and Sanskritists who have written about India, still, I hope, they will not be less susceptible of proof. We are daily reminded that, like unreasonable children, we have undertaken a task before which archaeologists and historians, aided by all the influence and wealth of the government, have shrunk dismayed, that we have taken upon ourselves a work which has proved to be beyond the capacities of the Royal Asiatic Society. Let it be so. Let everyone try to remember, as we ourselves remember, that not very long ago a poor Hungarian, who not only had no means of any kind but was almost a beggar, travelled on foot to Tibet through unknown and dangerous countries, led only by the love of learning and the eager wish to pour light on the historical origin of his nation. The result was that inexhaustible mines of literary treasures were discovered. Philology, which till then had wandered in the Egyptian darkness of etymological labyrinths, and was about to ask the sanction of the scientific world to one of the wildest of theories, suddenly stumbled on the clue of Ariadne. Philology discovered at last that the Sanskrit language is, if not the forefather at least, to use the language of Max Müller, the elder brother of all classical languages. Thanks to the extraordinary zeal of Alexander Ksoma-Dakoros, Tibet yielded a language the literature of which was totally unknown. He partly translated it and partly analysed and explained it. His translations have shown the scientific world that 1. The originals of the Zend Avesta, the sacred scriptures of the sun worshippers, of Tripitaka, that of the Buddhists, and of Aitareya Brahmanam, that of the Brahmans, were written in one and the same Sanskrit language. 2. That all these three languages, Zend, Nepalese, and the modern Brahmin Sanskrit, are more or less dialects of the first. 3. That Old Sanskrit is the origin of all the less ancient Indo-European languages, as well as of the modern European tongues and dialects. 4. That the three chief religions of heathendom, Zoroastrianism, Buddhism and Brahmanism, are mere heresies of the monotheistic teachings of the Vedas, which does not prevent them from being real ancient religions and not modern falsifications. The moral of all this is evident. A poor traveller, without either money or protection, succeeded in gaining admittance to the lamasseries of Tibet and to the sacred literature of the isolated tribe which inhabits it, probably because he treated the Mongolians and the Tibetans as his brothers, and not as an inferior race, a feat which has never been accomplished by generations of scientists. One cannot help feeling ashamed of humanity and science when one thinks that he whose labours first gave to science such precious results, he who was the first sower of such an abundant harvest, remained almost until the day of his death a poor and obscure worker. On his way from Tibet, he walked to Calcutta without a penny in his pocket. At last, Ksoma-Dakoros became known, and his name began to be pronounced with honour and praise whilst he was dying in one of the poorest parts of Calcutta. Being already very ill, he wanted to get back to Tibet, and started on foot again through Sikkim. He succumbed to his illness on the road and was buried in Darjeeling. It is needless to say, we are fully aware that what we have undertaken is simply impossible within the limits of ordinary newspaper articles. All we hope to accomplish is to lay the foundation stone of an edifice whose further progress must be entrusted to future generations. In order to combat successfully the theories worked out by 2 generations of Orientalists, half a century of diligent labour would be required. And in order to replace these theories with new ones, we must get new facts, facts founded not on the chronology and false evidence of scheming Brahmins, whose interest is to feed the ignorance of European Sanskritists, as, unfortunately, was the experience of Lieutenant Wilford and Louis Jacoliot, but on indubitable proofs that are to be found in inscriptions as yet undeciphered. The clue to these inscriptions Europeans do not possess, because, as I have already stated, it is guarded in MSS, which are as old as the inscriptions and which are almost out of reach. Even in case our hopes are realized and we obtain this clue, a new difficulty will arise before us. We shall have to begin a systematic refutation, page by page, of many a volume of hypotheses published by the Royal Asiatic Society. A work like this might be accomplished by dozens of tireless, never-resting Sanskritists, a class which, even in India, is almost as rare as white elephants. Thanks to private contributions and the zeal of some educated Hindu patriots, 2 free classes of Sanskrit and Pali had already been opened, one in Bombay by the Theosophical Society, the other in Benares under the presidency of the learned Rama Misra Shastri. In the present year, 1882, the Theosophical Society has, altogether, 14 schools in Ceylon and India. Our heads full of thoughts and plans of this kind, we, that is to say, 1 American, 3 Europeans and 3 natives, occupied a whole carriage of the Great Indian Peninsular Railroad on our way to Nasik, one of the oldest towns in India, as I have already mentioned, and the most sacred of all in the eyes of the inhabitants of the Western Presidency. Nasik borrowed its name from the Sanskrit word Nasika, which means nose. An epic legend assures us that on this very spot, Lakshman, the eldest brother of the deified king Rama, cut off the nose of the giantess Sarpnaka, sister of Ravana, who stole Sita, the Helen of Troy of the Hindus. The train stopped 6 miles from the town, so that we had to finish our journey in 6 2-wheeled gilded chariots called ekas and drawn by bullocks. It was 1:00 a.m., but in spite of the darkness of the hour, the horns of the animals were gilded and adorned with flowers, and brass bangles tinkled on their legs. Our way lay through ravines overgrown with jungle, where, as our drivers hastened to inform us, tigers and other 4-footed misanthropes of the forest played hide-and-seek. However, we had no opportunity of making the acquaintance of the tigers, but enjoyed instead a concert of a whole community of jackals. They followed us step by step, piercing our ears with shrieks, wild laughter and barking. These animals are annoying, but so cowardly that, though numerous enough to devour, not only all of us, but our gold-horned bullocks too, none of them dared to come nearer than the distance of a few steps. Every time the long whip, our weapon against snakes, alighted on the back of one of them, the whole horde disappeared with unimaginable noise. Nevertheless, the drivers did not dispense with a single one of their superstitious precautions against tigers. They chanted mantrams in unison, spread betel over the road as a token of their respect to the rajas of the forest, and after every couplet, made the bullocks kneel and bow their heads in honour of the great gods. Needless to say, the eka, as light as a nutshell, threatened each time to fall with its passenger over the horns of the bullocks. We had to endure this agreeable way of travelling for 5 hours under a very dark sky. We reached the Inn of the Pilgrims in the morning at about 6 o'clock. The real cause of Nasik's sacredness, however, is not the mutilated trunk of the giantess, but the situation of the town on the banks of the Godavari, quite close to the sources of this river which, for some reason or other, are called by the natives Ganga, Ganges. It is to this magic name, probably, that the town owes its numerous magnificent temples, and the selectness of the Brahmins who inhabit the banks of the river. Twice a year pilgrims flock here to pray, and on these solemn occasions the number of the visitors exceeds that of the inhabitants, which is only 35,000. Very picturesque but equally dirty are the houses of the rich Brahmins built on both sides of the way from the centre of the town to the Godavari. A whole forest of narrow pyramidal temples spreads on both sides of the river. All these new pagodas are built on the ruins of those destroyed by the fanaticism of the Mussulmans. A legend informs us that most of them rose from the ashes of the tail of the monkey god Hanuman. Retreating from Lanka, where the wicked Ravana, having anointed the brave hero's tail with some combustible stuff, set it on fire, Hanuman, with a single leap through the air, reached Nasik, his fatherland, and here the noble adornment of the monkey's back, burned almost entirely during the voyage, crumbled into ashes, and from every sacred atom of these ashes, fallen to the ground, there rose a temple. And, indeed, when seen from the mountain, these numberless pagodas, scattered in a most curious, disorderly way, look as if they had really been thrown down by handfuls from the sky. Not only the riverbanks and the surrounding country, but every little island, every rock peeping from the water is covered with temples, and not one of them is destitute of a legend of its own, different versions of which are told by every individual of the Brahmanical community according to his own taste, of course in the hope of a suitable reward. Here, as everywhere else in India, Brahmins are divided into two sects, worshippers of Shiva and worshippers of Vishnu, and between the two there is rivalry and warfare centuries old. Though the neighbourhood of the Godavari shines with a twofold fame derived from its being the birthplace of Hanuman and the theatre of the first great deeds of Rama, the incarnation of Vishnu, it possesses as many temples dedicated to Shiva as to Vishnu. The material of which the pagodas consecrated to Shiva are constructed is black basalt, and it is exactly the colour of the material which is the apple of discord in this case. The black material is claimed by the Vaishnavas as their own, it being of the same colour as the burned tail of Rama's ally. They try to prove that the Shivaites have no right to it. From the first days of their rule, the English inherited endless lawsuits between the fighting sectarians, cases decided in one law court only to be transferred on appeal to another, and always having their origin in this ill-omened tale and its pretensions. This tale is a mysterious deus ex machina that directs all the thoughts of the Nasik Brahmins pro and contra. On the subject of this tale were written more reams of paper and petitions than in the quarrel about the goose between Ivan Ivanitch and Ivan Nikiforitch, and more ink and bile were spilt than there was mud in Mirgorod since the creation of the universe. The pig that so happily decided the famous quarrel in Gogol would be a priceless blessing to Nasik, and the struggle for the tale. But unhappily even the pig, if it hailed from Russia, would be of no avail in India, for the English would suspect it at once and arrest it as a Russian spy. Rama's bathing place is shown in Nasik. The ashes of pious Brahmins are brought hither from distant parts to be thrown into the Godavari, and so to mingle forever with the sacred waters of Ganges. In an ancient MS, there is a statement of one of Rama's generals, who, somehow or other, is not mentioned in the Ramayana. This statement points to the river Godavari as the frontier between the kingdoms of Rama, king of Ayodhya, Uday, and of Ravana, king of Lanka, Ceylon. Legends and the poem of Ramayana state that this was the spot where Rama, while hunting, saw a beautiful antelope, and intending to make a present to his beloved Sita of its skin, entered the regions of his unknown neighbour. No doubt Rama, Ravana, and even Hanuman, promoted for some unexplained reason to the rank of a monkey, are historical personages who once had a real existence. About 50 years ago, it was vaguely suspected that the Brahmins possessed priceless MSS. It was reported that one of these MSS treats of the prehistoric epoch when the Aryans first invaded the country and began an endless war with the dark aborigines of southern India. But the religious fanaticism of the Hindus never allowed the English government to verify these reports. The most interesting sights of Nasik are its cave temples, about 5 miles from the town. The day before we started thither, I certainly did not dream that a tale would have to play an important part in our visit to Nasik, that, in this case, it would save me, if not from death, at least from disagreeable and perhaps dangerous bruises. This is how it happened. As the difficult task of ascending a steep mountain lay before us, we decided to hire elephants. The best couple in the town was brought before us. Their owner assured us that the Prince of Wales had ridden upon them and was very contented. To go there and back and have them in attendance the whole day, in fact the whole pleasure trip, was to cost us 2 rupees for each elephant. Our native friends, accustomed from infancy to this way of riding, were not long in getting on the back of their elephant. They covered him like flies, with no predilection for this or that spot of his vast back. They held on by all kinds of strings and ropes, more with their toes than their fingers, and on the whole presented a picture of contentment and comfort. We Europeans had to use the lady elephant, as being the tamer of the two. On her back there were two little benches with sloping seats on both sides, and not the slightest prop for our backs. The wretched undergrown youngsters seen in European circuses give no idea of the real size of this noble beast. The mahout, or driver, placed himself between the huge animal's ears, whilst we gazed at the perfected seats ready for us with an uneasy feeling of distrust. The mahout ordered his elephant to kneel, and it must be owned that in climbing on her back with the aid of a small ladder, I felt what the French call chair de poule. Our she-elephant answered to the poetical name of Chanchouli Peri, the active fairy, and really was the most obedient and the merriest of all the representatives of her tribe that I have ever seen. Clinging to each other, we at last gave the signal for departure, and the mahout goaded the right ear of the animal with an iron rod. First the elephant raised herself on her forelegs, which movement tilted us all back. Then she heavily rose on her hind ones too, and we rolled forwards, threatening to upset the mahout. But this was not the end of our misfortunes. At the very first steps of Peri, we slipped about in all directions like quivering fragments of blancmange. The journey came to a sudden pause. We were picked up in a hasty way, replaced on our respective seats, during which proceeding Peri's trunk proved very active, and the journey continued. The very thought of the 5 miles before us filled us with horror, but we would not give up the excursion, and indignantly refused to be tied to our seats, as was suggested by our Hindu companions, who could not suppress their merry laughter. However, I bitterly repented this display of vanity. This unusual mode of locomotion was something incredibly fantastical, and at the same time ridiculous. A horse carrying our luggage trotted by Peri's side and looked from our vast elevation no bigger than a donkey. At every mighty step of Peri, we had to be prepared for all sorts of unexpected acrobatic feats, while jolted from one side to the other by her swinging gait. This experience, under the scorching sun, unavoidably induced a state of body and mind something between seasickness and a delirious nightmare. As a crown to our pleasures, when we began to ascend a tortuous little path over the stony slope of a deep ravine, our Peri stumbled. This sudden shock caused me to lose my balance altogether. I sat on the hinder part of the elephant's back in the place of honour, as it is esteemed, and once thoroughly shaken, rolled down like a log. No doubt next moment I should have found myself at the bottom of the ravine, with some more or less sad loss to my bodily constitution, if it had not been for the wonderful dexterity and instinct of the clever animal. Having felt that something was wrong, she twisted her tail round me, stopped instantaneously, and began to kneel down carefully. But my natural weight was too much for the thin tail of this kind animal. Peri did not lose hold of me, but having at last knelt down, she moaned plaintively, though discreetly, thinking probably that she had nearly lost her tail through being so generous. The mahout hurried to my rescue, and then examined the damaged tail of his animal. We now witnessed a scene that clearly showed us the coarse cunning, greediness and cowardice of a low-class Hindu, of an outcast, as they are denominated here. The mahout very indifferently and composedly examined Peri's tail, and even pulled it several times to make sure, and was already on the point of hoisting himself quietly into his usual place, when I had the unhappy thought of muttering something that expressed my regret and compassion. My words worked a miraculous transformation in the mahout's behaviour. He threw himself on the ground and rolled about like a demoniac, uttering horrible wild groans. Sobbing and crying, he kept on repeating that the Mam Sahib had torn off his darling Peri's tail, that Peri was damaged for ever in everybody's estimation, that Peri's husband, the proud Airavati, lineal descendant of Indra's own favourite elephant, having witnessed her shame, would renounce his spouse, and that she had better die. Yells and bitter tears were his only answer to all remonstrances of our companions. In vain we tried to persuade him that the proud Airavati did not show the slightest disposition to be so cruel. In vain we pointed out to him that all this time both elephants stood quietly together, Airavati even at this critical moment rubbing his trunk affectionately against Peri's neck, and Peri not looking in the least discomfited by the accident to her tail. All this was of no avail. Our friend Narayan lost his patience at last. He was a man of extraordinary muscular strength, and took recourse to a last original means. With one hand he threw down a silver rupee, with the other he seized the mahout's muslin garment and hurled him after the coin. Without giving a thought to his bleeding nose, the mahout jumped at the rupee with the greediness of a wild beast springing upon its prey. He prostrated himself in the dust before us repeatedly, with endless salams, instantly changing his deep sorrow into mad joy. He gave another pull at the unfortunate tail, and gladly declared that, thanks to the prayers of the Sahib, it really was safe, to demonstrate which he hung on to it, till he was torn away and put back on his seat. Is it possible that a single miserable rupee can have been the cause of all this? We asked each other in utter bewilderment. Your astonishment is natural enough, answered the Hindus. We need not express how ashamed and how disgusted we all feel at this voluntary display of humiliation and greed. But do not forget that this wretch, who certainly has a wife and children, serves his employer for 12 rupees a year, instead of which he often gets nothing but a beating. Remember also the long centuries of tyrannical treatment from Brahmins, from fanatical Mussulmans, who regard a Hindu as nothing better than an unclean reptile, and, nowadays, from the average Englishman, and maybe you will pity this wretched caricature of humanity. But the caricature in question evidently felt perfectly happy, and not in the least conscious of a humiliation of any kind. Sitting on the roomy forehead of his Peri, he was telling her of his unexpected wealth, reminding her of her divine origin, and ordering her to salute the sahibs with her trunk. Peri, whose spirits had been raised by the gift of a whole stick of sugar-cane from me, lifted her trunk backwards and playfully blew into our faces. On the threshold of the Nasik caves, we bid goodbye to the modern pygmy India, to the petty things of her everyday life, and to her humiliations. We re-entered the unknown world of India, the great and the mysterious. The main caves of Nasik are excavated in a mountain bearing the name of Pandu Lena, which points again to the undying, persistent, primeval tradition that ascribes all such buildings to the 5 mythical brothers of prehistoric times. The unanimous opinion of archaeologists esteems these caves more interesting and more important than all the caves of Elephanta and Kali put together. And nevertheless, is it not strange? With the exception of the learned Dr. Wilson, who, it may be, was a little too fond of forming hasty opinions, no archaeologist has as yet made so bold as to decide to what epoch they belong, by whom they were erected, and which of the 3 chief religions of antiquity was the one professed by their mysterious builders. It is evident, however, that those who wrought here did not all belong either to the same generation or to the same sect. The first thing which strikes the attention is the roughness of the primitive work, its huge dimensions, and the decline of the sculpture on the solid walls, whereas the sculpture and carvings of the 6 colossi, which prop the chief cave on the 2nd floor, are magnificently preserved and very elegant. This circumstance would lead one to think that the work was begun many centuries before it was finished. But when? One of the Sanskrit inscriptions of a comparatively recent epoch, on the pedestal of one of the colossi, clearly points to 453 BC as the year of the building. At all events, Barth, Stevenson, Gibson, Reeves, and some other scientists, who being Westerns can have none of the prejudices proper to the native pundits, have formed this conjecture on the basis of some astronomical data. Besides, the conjunction of the planets stated in the inscription leaves no doubt as to the dates. It must be either 453 BC, or 1734 of our era, or 2640 BC, which last is impossible. because Buddha and Buddhist monasteries are mentioned in the inscription. I translate some of the most important sentences. To the most perfect and the highest, may this be agreeable to him, the son of King Kshaparata, lord of the Kshatriya tribe and protector of people, the ruler of Dinik, bright as the dawn, sacrifices 100,000 cows that graze on the river Banasa, together with the river, and also the gift of gold by the builder of this holy shelter of gods, the place of the curbing of the Brahman's passions. There is no more desirable place than this place, neither in Prabhasa, where accumulate hundreds of thousands of Brahmans repeating the sacred verse, nor in the sacred city Gaya, nor on the steep mountain near Dashatura, nor on the Serpent's Field in Govardhana, nor in the city Pratisraya where stands the monastery of Buddhists, nor even in the edifice erected by Dapanakara on the shores of the fresh water, sea. This place, giving incomparable favours, is agreeable and useful in all respects to the spotted deerskin of an ascetic. A safe boat given also by him who built the gratuitous ferry daily transports to the well-guarded shore. By him also who built the house for travellers and the public fountain. A gilded lion was erected by the ever-assaulted gate of this Govardhana, also another lion by the ferry boat, and another by Ramatirtha. Various kinds of food will always be found here by the scanty flock. For this flock more than 100 kinds of herbs and thousands of mountain roots are stored by this generous giver. In the same Govardhana, in the luminous mountain, this second cave was dug by the order of the same beneficent person during the very year when the sun, Shukra and Rahu, much respected by men, were in the full glory of their rise. It was in this year that the gifts were offered. Lakshmi, Indra and Yama, having blessed them, returned with shouts of triumph to their chariot, kept on the way free from obstacles the sky, by the force of mantrams. When they, the gods, all left, poured a heavy shower, and so on. Ran and Keheti are the fixed stars which form the head and the tail of the constellation of the dragon. Shukra is Venus. Lakshmi, Indra and Yama stand here for the constellations of Virgo, Aquarius and Taurus, which are subject and consecrated to these three among the 12 higher deities. The first caves are dug out in a conical hillock about 280 feet from its base. In the chief of them stand 3 statues of Buddha, in the lateral ones a lingam and 2 Jaina idols. In the top cave, there is a statue of Dharma Raja, or Yudhishthira, the eldest of the Pandus, who is worshipped in a temple erected in his honour, between Pent and Nasik. Farther on is a whole labyrinth of cells, where Buddhist hermits probably lived, a huge statue of Buddha in a reclining posture. And another as big, but surrounded with pillars adorned with figures of various animals. Styles, epochs, and sects are here as much mixed up and entangled as different trees in a thick forest. It is very remarkable that almost all the cave temples of India are to be found inside conical rocks and mountains. It is as though the ancient builders looked for such natural pyramids purposely. I notice this peculiarity in Kali, and it is to be met with only in India. Is it a mere coincidence? Or is it one of the rules of the religious architecture of the remote past? And which are the imitators, the builders of the Egyptian pyramids, or the unknown architects of the underground caves of India? In pyramids as well as in caves, everything seems to be calculated with geometrical exactitude. In neither case are the entrances ever at the bottom, but always at a certain distance from the ground. It is well known that nature does not imitate art, and as a rule, art tries to copy certain forms of nature. And if, even in this similarity of the symbols of Egypt and India, nothing is to be found but a coincidence, we shall have to own that coincidences are sometimes very extraordinary. Egypt has borrowed many things from India. We must not forget that nothing is known about the origin of the pharaohs, and that the few facts science has succeeded in discovering, far from contradicting our theory, suggest India as the cradle of the Egyptian race. In the days of remote antiquity, Kaluka Bhatta wrote, "During the reign of Visvamitra, first king of the Soma Vansha dynasty, after a 5 days battle, Manu Vena, the heir of ancient kings, was abandoned by the Brahmins and emigrated with his army, and having traversed Arya and Baria, at last reached the shores of Masra. Arya is Iran or Persia. Baria is an ancient name of Arabia. Masa or Masra is a name of Cairo, disfigured by Mussulmans into Misro and Musa. Kalukapata is an ancient writer. Sanskritists still quarrel over his epoch, wavering between 2000 years BC and the reign of the Emperor Akbar, the time of John the Terrible and Elizabeth of England. On the grounds of this uncertainty, the evidence of Kalukapata might be objected to. In this case, there are the words of a modern historian who has studied Egypt all his life, not in Berlin or London, like some other historians, but in Egypt, deciphering the inscriptions of the oldest sarcophagi and papyri, that is to say, the words of Henry Brugsch-Bey. I repeat, my firm conviction is that the Egyptians came from Asia long before the historical period, having traversed the Suez promontory, that bridge of all the nations, and found a new fatherland on the banks of the Nile. An inscription on a Hammamat rock says that Sankara, the last pharaoh of the 11th dynasty, sent a nobleman to Punt. I was sent on a ship to Punt to bring back some aromatic gum gathered by the princes of the Red Land. Commenting on this inscription, Brugsch-Bey explains that, under the name of Punt, the ancient inhabitants of Kemi meant a distant land surrounded by a great ocean, full of mountains and valleys, and rich in ebony and other expensive woods, in perfumes, precious stones and metals, in wild beasts, giraffes, leopards, and big monkeys. The name of a monkey in Egypt was Kaf, or Kafi, in Hebrew Kof, in Sanskrit Kapi. In the eyes of the ancient Egyptians, this Punt was a sacred land, because Punt or Panuta was the original land of the gods, who left it under the leadership of Amon, Manu Vena of Kalukapata, Hor and Hathor, and duly arrived in Kemi. Hanuman has a decided family likeness to the Egyptian Cynocephalus, and the emblem of Osiris and Shiva is the same. Qui vivra verra. Our return journey was very agreeable. We had adapted ourselves to Peri's movements and felt ourselves first-rate jockeys. But for a whole week afterwards, we could hardly walk.